Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous, and this is part 21 of a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. In this video, one of several on looping, we're going to be taking a look at how to do a decision-based loop within an Orchestrator workflow, and we're going to do so in a very common way. What we're going to be looping across is an array. I'll explain what that means in a moment, but let's jump in. Actually, just before we jump in, if you don't already have it, you need to go download the example workflows package that I've made available to you guys. You've heard about it in previous videos. If you haven't, go take a look at the URL down in the YouTube description. You might also want to take a look at video number 14, which talks about the package, but get the package if you don't already have it. Okay, so let's assume you've got it, and let's go into the Orchestrator client. Here in the Orchestrator client, as you can see, I have a workflow, and I've called this workflow array looping because what's going to happen in this workflow each time we go through this loop is it's going to do something to a VM. What's it going to do? Well, if we look in this schema element, each time it goes through this loop, this schema element is going to print the name of the VM, and it's going to print the amount of memory. It says name here. That should say memory there, but we'll correct that when we create this workflow on our own. So each time we go through the workflow, we're going to print the name and the amount of memory in that virtual machine. But you're wondering, how do we get the VMs? How do we know what VMs are out there? Well, this action here is going to go out to our vCenter server and get an array of every single VM in our entire environment. We'll then get to this decision element. This happens to be a custom decision. The custom decision is going to essentially ask, do we have more VMs to process in that array of VMs? If not, we're done. If there are more VMs to process, we'll go get one of the VMs from that array. We'll use this action, which I'll talk about more later. We'll use this action to get information about the VM. Specifically, it'll find out how much memory is in the VM. As I said before, this schema element is going to log information about the VM, the name of the VM, the size of the VM in terms of its memory. And then this schema element here is a special one called IncreaseCounter, which, as its name suggests, is used for incrementing counter variables. If you don't know what those are, I'll explain in a moment. And of course, there's the start and the end schema elements. But if you don't know about those by now, you're not watching this video anyways. So that's the basic mechanics of what's going on in this particular workflow. So why don't we poke a little bit deeper and see what we can about each of these schema elements. So this action, if you've never seen it before, actually I think you saw it in the previous video, but just in case you'd never seen this action before, let's edit the workflow. We'll edit the action. In case you've never noticed this before, sometimes you can't guess. Sometimes these names here get truncated and you can't figure out which action is this. Well, you can always edit the action, go to the scripting tab, and here you can see, let me unhighlight it. In that section there, you can see the name of the module. So go to the Actions tab, go into the modules. If you go into this module, the name of the action being called is called Get All VMs. In this particular case, it's taking, as we see in the empty parentheses here, this particular action is taking no inputs. All right, so continuing onwards here. Actually, one more thing about this Get All VMs. This action is going to return an array of virtual machines. Specifically, it's going to return an array of VC: virtual machines. Well, let's see where it's going to put those. If we go to Visual Binding, the array of virtual machines is getting stuffed into a variable called VMs. So VMs in my workflow is an array of virtual machines. There's another variable here called VM, which is going to be used later on to hold a single VM. Since this is an array, if you've ever worked with arrays before, you already know what a counter variable is. But in our workflow here, we've got this variable called I that's just going to be a counter variable so that we can say things like, it doesn't work quite like this, but just conceptually, if I is 1 and we say, show me VMs sub I, that would show us the first VM. Then if we increase the counter variable I to 2, it shows the second VM. Increase the counter variable 3 and say, show me VMs sub 3, it shows the third VM. Conceptually, that's all true. In reality, in JavaScript and in most programming languages, arrays aren't indexed from 1. So the first VM is not VM sub 1. It's actually 0. JavaScript arrays are indexed from 0. So file that away. That'll come in handy in a moment. So what else do we have here? So we have an array of VMs. If we use this index, this counter variable as an index into that array, we can get a single VM and store it into the single VM variable. And then later on, when we want to store information about that VM, we've got this other variable here called memory MB, which we're going to use to store the amount of memory. So that's actually all the variables that we have in our entire workflow, and we're going to see them in use in various places in this workflow. But the short version of this, the discussion of this action here, is this action returns a list of an array of VMs into a variable called VMs. This schema element, as you know, is a decision element. It's going to help us to decide whether to go into the loop again or exit the loop. Well, we want to go into the VM so long as there's more VMs in the array to process. So we'll start with VM number 0. And if there's more VMs, we'll just keep going through this loop again and again and again. So what does the condition test look like? Well, let's look at it. If we edit this workflow, we bring in 2 variables. Earlier when I showed you a custom decision, we only brought in 1 variable, but I told you you could bring in 2. And we need 2 in this case. We're going to bring in, with an inward binding, we're going to bring in the array of VMs and our counter variable. So in the beginning, when we first define our counter variable called I, we're going to set its value to 0. And then each time we go into this loop, we'll say, show me VMs sub I. Well, what's that look like? Well, you won't see it here. Actually, that comes up in the next schema element, but I'll show you that in a moment. Got a little ahead of myself. The test here is going to return true or false. So the expression here in parentheses is going to return true or false depending upon whether that counter variable is less than the length of the VMs array. Now, we know that the variable is called VMs because we picked the name of the variable, but how do we know that there's a property called .length? Well, the short answer to that, which I'll go into more detail later on in the next video, is you can look up all these properties for all the different types of objects using the API Explorer, which we can see here. Actually, we can do it here. Says array. Whenever you see these gray dot entries as a beginning Orchestrator developer, just skip them. So how do I know that there's a property of an array, a property called length? Well, if you go into the API Explorer, expand array, one of the properties of an array is its length. It says that's the length of the array. So if the length of the array is 5, then that means there's 5 VMs in that array. Again, indexing starts at 0, so length equals 4 or 5. Always run the possibility of being off by 1 here, but if I'm not mistaken, if there were 5 VMs in our array of VMs, the .length property would be 5. Not 4, not 6, but 5. And therefore, if we start off with I equals 0, 0 is less than 5. When we go to the second VM, I will be 1. 1 is less than 5. 2 is less than 5. 3 is less than 5. 4 is less than 5. Remember, the fourth index 4 into our array is the fifth VM. So when we get to that final iteration of the loop, it's the counter variable I is going to be 5, and 5 is not less than VMs.length, 5. Therefore, we'll pop out of this array loop. All right, not the best explanation I've ever given on that. If that didn't make sense, let me know, and I'll type that up better in the YouTube description. But anyways, I think you get the idea. So each time we go into this array, that I variable is going to act as the index into our VMs array, because what we want to do is get just one of the VMs from that array, because this action that's going to get the amount of memory needs to be fed in one VM. So we're going to get one VM off the array with this schema element here. How do we do that? Well, we bring in the VMs array. We bring in the counter variable so that in our code, we can say that singular VM variable that I mentioned before, not the VMs array, but this variable that holds a single VM, we're going to set up an outward binding to that variable, the single VM variable, we're going to set its value equal to, and then we're going to use the I variable as an index into that VM's array. VM equals VM sub I puts one VM into the VM variable. The VM's array is still left intact exactly as it was. Nothing's changing in the VM's array, but our variable called VM will have one VM in it. Now, at some point in the loop, we're going to need to increase that I variable. And just to illustrate that you could do it here, you'll see, let me uncomment this code here so you can see it better. I could increment the I variable here in the same scriptable task that's getting the one VM. If I want to change the I variable, I would need an inward binding so that I can see what the current value of I is. I needed that anyways. But if I want to change the value of I need an outward binding. So if you don't understand parameter binding, go back to something like video number 7 or something like that. You got to understand parameter binding or this will not make any sense. So if I want to, I can increase the I counter variable here within the code. I can do it the way I illustrate here, or maybe you like the shorthand notation, but one way or another, somewhere or another, we're going to need to increment the I variable each time we go through the loop. Now I'm commenting out this code here because I want to show you another way to increment the value. But now our VM singular, our VM variable has one VM. We can feed that VM as input into the get memory in megabytes action. That action, again, takes the VM that we just discovered, finds out how much memory is in there, and stores that answer into the memory in megabytes variable. In the scriptable task, which we saw before, it's going to take the VM and the amount of memory as input so that it can log information. So log the name of the VM, log the memory, I know that says name, but log the memory in the VM. And then as I said before, at some point in our loop, we need to increment the counter variable or decrement it. You don't have to go, you don't have to increase the counter variable. You can create loops where you're decreasing the variable. But instead of doing the increment in here, there's a special schema element called IncreaseCounter that allows you to easily increment the variable. I'll show you how to use that in a moment. But every time we go through this loop, the value of I is going to increase by 1 because of the presence of this schema element. So that's the mechanics of what's going on in this workflow. Let's see it in actual practice. Let's actually implement this from scratch. So since I don't want to clobber this one, let me go over to the General tab. I'm going to change the name of this one to Original. And we're going to create this workflow from scratch. So let's create the workflow from scratch. We'll say New Workflow. And we are going to say this one's called Array Looping. Now, we can create this workflow in a variety of different ways. We don't have to do it in a particular order, but let's just off the top of our heads create the variables that I can remember we're going to need. Let's see, we're going to need a variable, since we want to process a list of VMs, we're going to need a variable, let's call it VMs. And it's not going to be a string of VMs. It's not going to be the names of VMs. It's going to be actual objects for the VMs themselves. So I'm going to change the type to vc:virtual machine. Way up here on the top. There's VC virtual machine. And this variable is going to be an array of VC virtual machines. Now, I'll be the array of virtual machines. I'm not going to set the value here in the workflow because I'm not going to set the value as I define the workflow because that variable's value is going to get set when the workflow runs. I should type a description, but I'm feeling like saving a little time in this video, so I'm going to skip my descriptions here, but you know that's bad. Let's create another variable called VM. Whereas the previous one was an array of virtual machines, this one's just going to hold a single virtual machine. Again, should type a description, but I'm not going to. I could set a value, but I'm not going to because the workflow is going to set the value. What else do I need? I need a counter variable. You could call the counter variable counter. That might be a little more obvious to somebody else who's reading your workflow, but it's pretty common to call counter variables short names like I or J or K. So I'm going to just go with that convention. It's not going to be a string. It's instead going to be a number. And unlike these previous two variables whose value I didn't set, I am going to set my initial counter variable value to not 1, because in JavaScript, arrays do not start indexing at 1. They start at 0. And again, I should type a description, but I'm not going to. One more attribute called, let's call it memory MB. So the amount of memory in the virtual machine in megabytes. Again, that's going to be a number. And again, I'm not going to bother setting the value here because the workflow is going to set the value. So now I've got my variables. Well, that's good. I don't need any inputs. I don't need any outputs. So we'll jump to the schema. And the first thing we're going to do in our workflow is call an action. And that action is going to, if I can drag and drop a little more carefully, there we go. This one's going to get all virtual machine, get all VMs. Let's see. And notice that there's a whole bunch of other really useful actions for getting VMs. I'm getting all the VMs for all of the hosts, for all the clusters, for my entire environment. But if you just wanted all the VMs in a particular data center, or all the VMs in a particular cluster, or all the VMs that make use of a particular data store, these are just like get all VMs, but they return something. They return virtual machines, but a smaller subset of virtual machines, and you have to specify an input. For instance, in this example, you'd have to say which data center you want the VMs from. But we're going to go nice and simple here. We'll say get all VMs. I'll select it once so that I can double check, is that the right one? Yep. This is a action that's defined by VMware. This isn't one I created. This is one that's in Orchestrator by default. It's the one I want. So I'll say get all VMs. Now the next thing I'm going to do is drag it out. I could possibly do a decision, a basic decision, but more often than not, I'll use custom decision. I know in this case I'm going to have to use a custom decision because the decision used 2 variables, not just 1. So let's see if I can drag one of these out here and position it in the right place. And you'll notice we don't have a loop, but we've got the beginnings of a loop. So we're going to need to have this green path loop back around, which we're not quite ready to do yet, but we're going to. But first, what are we going to do? Let's define our decision for when we go back into the loop versus get out. Well, we do that by editing our decision schema element. I'm not going to need to do anything on the info tab, but on the in tab, not only do I want to bring in the VMs and the counter variable, let me say that the other way around. Not only do I want to bring in the counter variable to see if I've gone across the whole array of VMs, in order to know if I've gone across the whole array of VMs, one way to do that is to look at the .length property of the VMs variable. So I'm going to bring that variable in too. So we now have 2 variables on which to do our decision, and our decision is essentially going to look like this. It'll say I is less than VMs.length. By the way, if you want to get really fancy here, I told you earlier there are different places you could do the increment. You could possibly do I++ here, but that's getting a little harder to read. You cannot do this. You cannot say I equals I plus 1 here because we've already returned out of the code. But again, I don't typically like to do my increments in the decision itself. It's not expected that you do that, and it's more of a side effect. So we'll go with the more traditional approach here. Return whether I is less than the length of the array. Okay, let's build us a loop. So one of the things I want to do in the loop is get one of the VMs. So I'm dragging a scriptable task in. It's going to be responsible for getting 1 VM. Now to do that, let's do our visual binding first. We're going to store that VM into a variable called VM. So I've now got, my mouse is sticking here, there we go. I've now got an outward binding from this schema element so that I can save one VM at a time. Well, to get that VM, I need the array of VMs, and I need to know which VM we're on. So I bring in the VMs array, so I have the list of all the VMs, and the I variables so that I know which VM we want. So the code here at this point, as you saw before, is pretty straightforward. We're going to say VM equals VMs sub I, square bracket. In case I keep saying sub, I learned about arrays so long ago, I don't even remember if sub is actually proper geeky speak, but the index value, whenever I say things like array name, such as VM sub something, the sub is the index value into the array. The proper syntax for getting a particular member of the array is array name, square bracket, index of some sort, square bracket, and the rest of this, like the semicolon, the VM equals, isn't part of the array. This is the array expression right here. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's zoom back out and let's see. Yeah, that's all I need to do. So we're good there. Another thing we wanted to do in this loop was to call, I don't even remember its name, get memory. Yeah, that's the one. Get memory in megabytes from VM is a action that I defined. I can tell it's an action that I defined because it's in the module called info.vvork. Well, info.vvork, anything is a module I defined, so I know that's the right one. Okay, so I double check that's the right action. I double click the action. And now, just as if I was calling a workflow, if you call an action, you need to hook it up. So I'm going to go edit the action. I'm going to look at visual binding, because that's one of the easiest ways to find out what the contract is. It has automatically guessed how to set up the input. So it's feeding in the one VM that we just got through this inward binding. And that action is going to return the number of, as a number, it's going to return the amount of memory in that virtual machine. Well, I need to bind this variable called action result to one of my variables. And you know that I created a variable called memory MB. So that's all it takes to hook up that action. Let me close this here. Let's see, what else do we need to do? Oh, we need to log what we find about that virtual machine and its memory. So let's say log some info. Now the info that we're going to get here is the info that we're going to get is all in the variable called VM. So let's bring in that variable. And I'm not going to have any output from this. In terms of variables, I'm not going to have any output from this scriptable task. Instead, the output's going to get logged into the log file. So I don't have any output variables, so I can leave that alone as it is. Instead, what I'll do is say exciting things like system.log name colon plus VM dot. If you can't remember the name of the property, remember variable that holds an object dot and then type control space will give you a list of the variables, the object's properties. I happen to know that this one is called dot name. So I'm just finding dot name. There's dot name. So there's our first line of code. And then the second line of code is pretty darn similar. I tried to copy and paste. Can't type sometimes without looking at the keyboard, so I kind of blew that. Let's say VRAM in megabytes. Is that a colon? There we go. Colon VM dot. Actually, it is possible to go through this VM variable to find out how much memory is in there, but you'll recall I already have a variable called memory MB that holds the value. Pop quiz. Why is this variable VM pink, but this variable memory MB is not pink? Hit the pause button and stop and think about it if you don't know the answer automatically. If you've been watching these videos, though, you know that the answer is that we need to have an inward binding to that memory MB variable. There we go. That looks good. And one other thing that we need to do is, what do we need to do? We need to either use a scriptable task to increment the counter variable, or there's these predefined schema elements like IncreaseCounter. So let's drag IncreaseCounter into our workflow. Let's edit it. And IncreaseCounter is super simple to use. You just go to the Visual Binding tab and notice that that schema element has a variable it calls counter. And all we're going to do is hook it up both inwardly and outwardly to our counter variable. So his counter variable, we're now setting up an inward binding to our counter variable called I. And we have to do the same thing as an outward binding. Boom, done. That's all it takes. That's part of what's so beautiful about IncreaseCounter. It's nice and simple to use. And sometimes it's nice in the code. Not the code. Sometimes it's nice in your schema itself to actually see that incrementing is going on, as opposed to incrementing that's going on buried down in some scriptable task. But we now have everything set up, I think, pretty much perfectly, except for one drastic omission, which is that we need this branch to loop back to here. Now I'm going to show you two ways of doing this. Actually, I'll show you multiple ways. Since I want to be able to revert each time, I'm going to click Save. Okay, here's the first way I've seen people do this. Actually, trying to decide which order. I'm going to do this a little differently. If you take the endpoint and drag it and drop it on where you want to loop back to, ta-da! You've created a loop, but nobody can see that it's a loop without looking really closely. See how these arrows are all overlapping? It's totally confusing. Rather than create a loop by dragging and dropping straight back or straight up, let me revert and show you a simple technique here. As long as you move one of the schema elements, when you then drag and drop the endpoint, it's real obvious right from the start that this is a loop that we've got going on. And I can position things as I see fit to make it look nice, but whenever you want to drag that endpoint and loop it back, just move one of the schema elements even just a little bit so that you'll be able to see the loop. Alternatively, you could, let me revert, you could do that bad, in my opinion, bad first approach, and then select something and move it, and now it's becoming a little more apparent that this is a loop. But I personally find it easier. I can't click it. I don't like that technique. I'm just going to revert. So here's one more technique. I can see maybe sometimes you might unintentionally get yourself in a situation where you need this, but I've seen people do it this way. Select the arrow to the endpoint, delete it. I don't like deleting, but delete. Hang on, my mouse is sticking. And then to create the loop, well, you're still going to want to do that trick of moving this. But to create the loop, since I don't have the endpoint to move anymore, what you can do is grab the blue arrow. In case you missed that, that's the blue arrow. Let me pause so you can see that. See the blue arrow? Drag the blue arrow back, and you create a loop. I don't use that last technique because it's not necessary, and maybe it's just me, but I have a tendency when I start deleting arrows to mess things up in ways that I don't intend. So you can do it that way, but again, I think the easiest way whenever you want to create the loop is just drag one of these somewhere like there, and then drag the endpoint, and boom, you're done. Maybe you want to position even a bit more, but I think that's the best technique. If you want to argue that with me, there's the YouTube comment section down below. Go ahead and tell me that I'm wrong and that my way's stupid. Or alternatively, if you know other ways of creating loops that you think works well, let us know. I'd love to know. I'm not totally opposed to those other ways. I just find this way works the easiest for me. So if I'm not mistaken, we've got our loop all set up here. Let's validate it. Fingers crossed. Okay, output parameter. Oh, did you catch that? So the output parameter of the action called get all VMs didn't get set because I forgot. So let's go back there. Hang on. Let's go back to get all VMs. I don't know how I managed to do this. I got so excited about the next part. I guess I just skipped over this, but we need to save that array of VMs. Oh, thank goodness for validate. Let's validate again. That looks better. I'm going to save. I'm going to click run. And if we watch real closely, we could see it looping through our workflow. So it's getting all the VMs, and then the next part's going to be hard to see because it's going to loop through here pretty quickly. Maybe if I scroll over, we'll have a chance to see it. Okay, there it goes. Boom, done. So you couldn't really see a whole lot going on there. By the way, I don't know if it's just in this Mac version of the vRO client, but sometimes the logs, when I do a system.log, they don't show up immediately here in the logging section. Sometimes I've noticed I need to switch to debug and switch back to info to actually see them. But in my environment, I've got two VMs. One's called VC, that's my vCenter server. Another VM called vRO. The vCenter VM is 10 gigabytes. The vRO VM is 6 gigabytes or thereabouts. And I now have a workflow that's looping through, in this case, just 2 VMs. But if I had 20 VMs or 200 VMs or 2,000 VMs, it's a fabulous tool to have in your bag of tricks. You need to be able to create loops, and in this video I showed you how to create a decision-based loop that happens to be traversing an array. You don't have to traverse array, but that is a common thing to do. In the next video, video number 22, I'm going to show you a decision-based loop that's very similar to this, but instead of using an array, we're going to use something else called a stack. If you don't know what a stack is, don't worry, you're going to find out in the next video. So I'll see you over in video number 22.